Diversity higher, they laughed, then she erased 12 drones in 4:17, in 0G. Welcome back to SciFi Nebula, where human grit meets impossible tech. Tonight, a commander mocks the token sniper, until a woman with a coil rifle rewrites physics and the rules of who gets to lead. Chapter 1, Arrival at Dam Neck Orbital. The shuttle's belly kissed the docking rail and held. A soft thud, a ripple through the hull, and the viewport framed the Atlantic like a sheet of hammered steel far below. The Dam Neck Orbital range spun steady over the coastline, an old Taurus whose paint had given up arguing with salt and sun years ago. The ring didn't gleam. It endured. Maya Wren stood as the maglocks finished their mutter. She shouldered a scuffed equipment bag and a rifle case whose foam had been cut and recut to fit whatever the mission needed. Her watch vibrated once against her wrist. The face was scratched to fog. In the gouged glass you could still read the engraving if you knew to look, MW, forever watching. A Marine gate guard scanned her orders, then scanned her, the way people do when the paperwork doesn't match the person. His eyes flicked to the case. Sniper support, he asked because the line said so and the brain didn't. Sniper, Maya said, polite as a locked door. The inner hatch rolled open on a corridor of old navy gray, lines of tape in colors that had lost their names decades back. The ring had been refitted for every new doctrine since before Maya was born: wind tunnels when wind mattered, vacuum bays when it didn't, variable G belts for anything that needed to lie about gravity. You could hear its history in the floor, every second step a different tone where a plate had been swapped, bolted, persuaded. Trident Group's unit plaque, a brass trident with a thin black edge, hung over a hatch with a thumb reader slick from generations of calloused hands. Maya pressed her thumb. The hatch coughed open. Commander Morrison owned the team room the way weather owns a plains town. He was 6 foot plus, the kind of big that makes furniture look flimsy. He talked while his hands made lines in the air that the team read like maps: push here, cut there, in, out, home. Men laughed in the places where laughter goes. When Maya knocked and stepped in, the air didn't change. It calcified. Gentlemen, Morrison announced without looking at the orders. Meet our new sniper support specialist. The last 2 words landed wet. Apparently someone at SOCOM believes diversity shoots straighter than doctrine. A few chuckles scraped the walls. Not many. Too loud and the joke turns on you. Too quiet and you look like the kind of man who thinks first. Maya walked to an empty chair that smelled faintly of solvent and sat. She set the rifle case beside her boots, the bag under the chair, the watch face down against her wrist so its scratches caught her skin instead of her eye. Her back found the chair's hard edge and made peace with it. She looked at Morrison the way you look at bad weather on a radar, measured, impersonal, inevitable. Master Chief Rodriguez noticed her before he let himself notice that he had. He was the sort of man whose silence wore a rank all its own. 50-ish, broad across the chest in a way that had stopped being a choice years ago, hands like he could still bend steel if steel annoyed him. He watched Maya lift the case latches with her thumbs and not her fingers, a habit older than most apps. He watched her rest the rifle on her thighs, left hand floating the bolt as if it were a living thing, eyes tracking a check sequence no one teaches anymore because algorithms smile and promise they'll do it for you. Rodriguez felt a thin wire pull tight behind his sternum. He'd seen that ritual before. Afghanistan. A body in dust. A name carved into him in a place the years couldn't reach. He shoved the wire down into the old toolbox in his head and closed the lid gentler than the feeling deserved. The briefing rolled. Weather. Satellite. A cargo run turned stress shoot at noon in Bay 9. Morrison's voice walked every syllable like it had rights. When he finished, the room stood as one machine. Operators peeled off for gear, checklists, energy bars they'd curse and swallow anyway. Morrison stopped speaking to his team and started speaking to the room. You, he said to Maya without using her name. You can set up at the outer line. I don't need you in anyone's way. If you see a flag that says wind, he smiled as if he'd invented the word, try not to breathe it in wrong. Yes, sir, Maya said. The sir came out smooth and correct. It didn't curtsy. The damn neck range stretched around the Taurus like a mile-long throat. A dozen bays opened to blackness beyond their field generators, real vacuum where it mattered, variable gusts where romance with gravity still insisted. Bay 9's deck was all black rubber and scoring marks. At the far end, a curtain of safety glass had been patched so many times it looked like a map of an old war. Sensors hung like wind chimes from a gantry over the kill box. There were flags out there, too, not cloth but clusters of microdebris pinned on smart filaments, twitching to the song of solar gusts. Morrison slung a battered Remington 700 spiritual descendant onto the bench like a dare, M700X Gauss long gun, bolt throw manual, coils old enough to creak when the room went quiet. The scope was misaligned 2 clicks left and 1 down, the kind of sabotage that reads like a mistake in the after-action. You'll like her, Morrison said, patting the stock. She's traditional. Doesn't talk back. Maya said nothing. She ran the bolt with the kind of patience you save for animals. A coil pinged once in the receiver, short, guilty. She set the rifle down, opened her notebook, and wrote without looking up. Tiny, neat numbers, wind, drift, roll, laid themselves on the page like they had a place to be. She touched the watch without checking the time. Skin to metal, a small prayer with no priest in it. Lieutenant Sarah Chen sidled in as if she'd been there all along. Intel wore her like a habit. She stood with a tablet and made notes the way rain makes water. She watched the commander watch the new arrival, and the attention felt like a theater meant to sell tickets to men who already had seats. The first qual was the kind of exam you fail if you think you're being watched and pass if you remember to breathe. 45 rounds, varying ranges, gust simulation up to 15 knots through the bay. Maya slid into prone and found the earth that wasn't there. Her breath went low. Her cheekbone kissed the stock. She took a shot that sounded like a factory floor light switch and reached for the bolt as the target rockered. Her second shot broke before the first plate had finished its protest. Down the line, a younger operator with a fresh oak leaf on his shoulder whispered, "Damn." Morrison didn't whisper. "Lucky flags," he said, as if objects conspire on command. Maya didn't consult the debris filaments at all. She watched the hair on the back of a tech's wrist flutter as he reached for a panel, read the microdrift of dust along a seam, felt the deck vibrate as the Taurus nudged a hair into station keeping. Old school. Pre-app. The sort of awareness you keep when the battery dies. She re-zeroed the scope herself in 6 shots with a grace that looked almost bored. Rodriguez's breath snagged in his throat on the 4th, minute adjustment left, quarter down, then an elevation correction that took roll and the coil's age into account. He wasn't watching a shooter. He was watching handwriting he hadn't seen in a decade show up in the margins of a page written by a different hand. Between strings, she field stripped only what needed it. A rag, actual cloth, frayed, clean, threaded through the bore with 2 turns of her wrist. She bent to the bolt face like she could hear where it would complain, dabbed solvent with a measured fingertip, then left a part alone because perfect is the enemy of repeatable. She closed the receiver with a touch that would have made a fussy instrument sigh. Morrison drifted over like a storm pretending to be a breeze. "You got a phone to tell you where to point?" he asked. Maya lifted her head from the stock. "I have eyes," she said. The sentence had no edges. The silence after did. By mid-morning the range leaned toward her without realizing it had. A couple of Team 3 shooters rotated their ear pro down to hear the cadence of her shots. Bolt. Crack. Reset. Center. It was a metronome, not music, precise enough to make arrogance nervous. Rodriguez moved closer because not moving felt like disrespect to memory. Up close he saw the watch more clearly, saw the M and the W under the scratches, saw the way her thumb brushed the face before a difficult shot, not checking the time, just anchoring herself to something small and stubborn. The wire behind his sternum pulled again, hard this time. He pulled a deep breath over it and let it cut. When Maya posted her first target, the tightness of the group made one of Morrison's loyalists, Thompson, laugh reflexively and then choke on it. Beginner's luck, Morrison said out loud, and no one on the line disagreed because the hierarchy of a room is a survival mechanism. Still, the young lieutenant's head tilted the way a dog's does when a sound is new. Morrison gathered the team at noon under the bay's gantry as if holding court. Wind spiked against the filaments like rain on tin. "Since our hire believes she can read," he called, loud enough to ping the far deck, "we'll graduate her to something worth the attention." Operators filed into a half-circle, the human shape of judgment. Even personnel from other bays drifted over, drawn by the sound the day was making. He pointed across the kill box where 12 small drones slept along the catwalks. Independent movers. Random vectors. 3-second windows. Ranges from 3 to 1,000 meters. The record is 8 minutes, 43 seconds. I'm feeling generous. He looked down the line and found her eyes. 5 minutes. Fail, and you can explain to the Admiral why we burned propellant to bring a brochure to a gunfight. Maya stood. The watch ticked against bone. The room leaned in to see if she would lean back. She didn't. She checked nothing with her phone. She wet a finger and lifted it shoulder high, felt the air where there wasn't air, the eddy of the station's cycle, the push of thermal plumes bleeding from a vent, the rhythm of rotation under her ribs. She marked numbers in her book with a tiny pencil worn to a nub. Lieutenant Chen raised her tablet like a mirror. She wasn't filming for gossip. She was archiving because some mornings make case studies before lunch. 30 seconds prep, Morrison barked, enjoying the theater. Maya slid prone and became smaller. Breathing fell into step with the faint quiver of deck plates. Scope shadow turned to coin-bright clarity. She lifted the bolt without taking her eye from the world and felt it like a physician feels a pulse. The first drone loaned her 3 ticks of noise before it woke. She found the lane it hadn't chosen yet. "Time begins at first shot," the range officer said, voice hovering between curiosity and pity. Maya exhaled and let the crosshair float, not where the drone was but where it would be after it forgot it was clever. She touched the trigger. The coil sang, the target obeyed. Someone behind her, Thompson, maybe, let out a sound built for church. Morrison's mouth opened. Closed. The second drone popped at 400, fast and mean. Maya's bolt hand moved like a consequence, her breath already in the next moment. Crack. The second plate snapped backward as if a string had been pulled. The third didn't live long enough for drama. By the fourth, men stopped pretending to check their own rifles. By the fifth, Chen's knuckles had gone bloodless on the tablet's edge. Rodriguez didn't realize he'd stepped closer until he could hear her breath. It wasn't calm. It was controlled, a distinction earned, not taught. At 1,000 meters the killbox added a joke, erratic motion plus station roll, the kind of problem that makes good shooters look like they're riding with their offhand. Wind plumes from a maneuvering thruster flicked the debris flags horizontal. Someone muttered something about halt and wait. Maya didn't wait. She banked the shot through the gust like she'd grown up throwing paper planes down stairwells and could feel where the warm air would lift it. The rifle spoke. 2 seconds of emptiness later, the far plate kicked like it owed somebody money. Morrison's face went a color men go when life refuses to stay inside the boxes they made for it. He didn't say lucky this time. He didn't say anything at all. Maya's watch ticked against her skin once, twice, reminding her that time was a thing the living always lose. She stacked the next 3 shots like coins. The 11th target died mid-swerve. The 12th woke with a stutter, lateral, stop, drop, feint, pivot, an algorithm designed to humiliate. Maya's mouth tightened a hair as she sensed the killbox's rhythm change. The station's roll sunk into her bones. She lifted the muzzle, just a whisper, as if to ask a question. The coil sang again. 2 seconds stretched until they were a film across the air. The drone turned into the bullet because that's what math does when you ask nicely and mean it. The buzzer blared. The range officer stared at his timer as if it had betrayed him. 4:17, he said, the numbers falling out of his mouth like he hadn't agreed to them in advance. Silence. Then the shuffle of 100 truths changing shoes. Maya safed the rifle, folded her notebook, and stood. She didn't smile. The watch face flashed in a strip of light. Morrison stepped forward on legs that looked like they'd forgotten whose job it was to hold him. He opened his mouth to manufacture a new story when the bay's outer hatch cycled and a black Sockham shuttle nose-kissed the docking rail with the confidence of a man who walks into a room because it is already his. Stars on a collar. Weathered face. General Thompson's gaze cut across the killing floor and found her the way a hawk finds the only thing not pretending to be a rock. He walked past Morrison as if the commander were a piece of furniture someone would move later. Sergeant Williams, he said to Maya, voice quiet enough to make men lean in. I should have recognized that style before your second shot. The second silence of the day arrived and chose a chair. In the edges of it, Rodriguez felt the wire behind his sternum snap and begin to sing like something that had been tight too long. He looked at the watch, the initials, the way her thumb pressed the glass, and the years finally stood up to introduce themselves. Morrison tried to rescue the narrative with rank. Sir, with respect, this is an outside support. Thompson lifted a hand. Commander, he said without heat. Why are you hazing the daughter of Master Gunnery Sergeant Michael Ghost Williams? The name hit the bay like a door slamming open in a storm. A half-dozen men flinched because their memory had just walked in wearing boots. Someone swore and then pressed a palm to his mouth. Rodriguez stepped forward because his legs had already decided. General, he said, throat dry as a chalkboard. I was one of the 8. Thompson nodded, almost a bow. Then today is overdue. Morrison's jaw worked. My brother, he began, and the sentence fractured under the weight of everything he hadn't let himself feel until now. Maya's hand closed around the watch. Her face didn't change much. The stillness in it did, the way a lake changes when a wind arrives from very far away. Sir, she said to Thompson, voice steady, and in a single syllable lived everything the room had missed about who she was and how she'd gotten here. The range exhaled as if someone had lifted a weight off its ribs. Targets hung torn. The drone rails clicked as they reset. A gull cried against the station's skin and, below, the Atlantic turned over once without comment. The morning had arrived expecting entertainment. It had found a reckoning. Chapter 2, Ghost Revealed. General Thompson didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Rank moved through the bay the way pressure does, quiet, everywhere at once. Sergeant Williams, he said again, stopping a meter from Maya. Closer now, the lines around his eyes looked cut in with a blade and regret. You shoot like your father when it matters and like yourself when it doesn't. I should have seen it by the third bolt. A dozen operators inhaled like one creature trying to grow an extra lung. Maya kept her cheekbones loose, jaw neutral, breath a small metronome in her ribs. The watch felt heavy as if it had been filled with a different metal mid-sentence. My legal name is Wren, sir, she said. Mother's surname. Thompson nodded. And the name on your blood? Maya tilted the watch face once toward him. The scratched engraving caught the bay lights, MW, forever watching, and she didn't have to say anything else. Commander Morrison had been built for forward momentum, brief, shoot, sleep, repeat, but he stood like he'd hit a bulkhead that refused to yield and discovered the wall was inside him. General, he started, voice pitched wrong, she arrived assigned as someone you were responsible for, Thompson said without looking away from Maya. As someone you chose to treat as a problem to be solved with ridicule. The United States paid for that time, Commander. It belongs to her, and to the men who will live because she's here. The words didn't slap, they landed and sat down. Master Chief Rodriguez stepped forward because he could no longer stand where he was without lying to his bones. "Sir," he said, eyes on Maya, not the general. "Permission to," he stopped, swallowed, and tried again. "I owe a debt." "You owe 8 debts, Thompson said softly. "You were there." "I was," Rodriguez said, and suddenly the room wasn't a room, it was cold dark dirt with stars riddled like bullet holes and a ridge that ate men for breakfast. He saw it again, the muzzle flashes that were never going to stop, the radio coy as a slot machine, the way time stretched until it felt like someone was pulling it out of his chest with pliers. "Your father held that ridge," he told Maya. "Longer than physics had promised any of us. He wasn't supposed to be there. The plan had him glazing, the plan broke, he stayed. 8 of us walked because one Marine decided his last bullet would be a time machine. The bay gave him its silence. Even the hum of the field coils sounded like respect. Morrison made a small sound, the kind proud men make when pride and shame choose the same doorway. My brother was one of the 8, he said, words scraping. Danny. Team 4. Maya turned enough to see him without granting him too much. Petty Officer Second Class Daniel Morrison, she said, each syllable placed with care. Married to Jennifer. Their daughter had a lisp when she was 5, the speech therapist taught her to sing RS before she could say them. He wrote about all of you. He tried to make the fear in his letters look like weather reports. My dad underlined the parts where he thought bravery looked ordinary. Morrison's shoulders caved a fraction. Something in his face went young and unarmored. He took a step that wasn't toward her or away, just a step to prove he still knew how to move. 13 years I've been angry at the wrong wind, he said. It should have been me on that patrol. It should have been me in the dirt when the birds couldn't land. And today he stopped. Words are a kind of ammunition, he was out. Maya crossed the distance for him because forgiveness does not require surrender. She put her hand on his shoulder the way you steady a ladder. You owe respect, she said. To your team. To the name you carry. To the job. Not to me. Her fingers squeezed once and withdrew. I'm not here to be your absolution. I'm here to do work. Lieutenant Sarah Chen slid nearer, tablet down by her thigh, thumb hovering over the red record icon without touching it. She knew what history looked like, she also knew when it needed privacy to grow before anyone wrote it down. Sergeant, Thompson said, gentler now. 2 questions. 1, why here, why now? Because there's a hole in the pipeline, Maya said. We graduate shooters who can quote ballistics but panic when their battery dies. We treat reading wind like extracurricular. We build teams on myth and paper. The men who lived at Kuhner didn't survive on theory, they survived because one human made 12 correct decisions in a row while bleeding. I don't know how to fix everything. I know how to teach what he taught me. And 2, Thompson said, why hide the name? Maya touched the watch with her thumb, the ritual steadied oxygen. I wanted to earn a call sign before someone handed me a legacy. I did the foster home circuit pretending not to be angry. I enlisted under Ren because the recruiter had eyes, and pity is a lousy meal. Scout sniper school was better, no speeches, just maps. First in my class. They asked for interviews, I asked for assignments that didn't have microphones. It worked until it didn't. You could feel the room rerunning everything they'd said and thought since morning and breaking it into smaller, more honest pieces. The general finally looked at Morrison. Commander, do you have anything fit to say? He straightened like an old rope forced to learn right angles. Sergeant Wren, Williams, Maya, he said, choosing her first name because rank had failed him and he needed a human word. I used you as a mirror for my fear. I called it standards. It was vanity. I can ask you not to transfer out. I can ask you to let me prove there are things I know besides how to be loud. I cannot ask you to forgive what I haven't paid for. He exhaled. But I can start paying. In policy. In practice. In who gets promoted. Maya didn't make him stand in the stocks any longer than necessary. Start by ending the range theater, she said. No more mis-zeroed optics as hazing. No more stacked drills to force failure. Publish criteria. Measure them. One more thing, when we debrief, we talk about when not to shoot. A few heads turned for that last. The idea felt political until you remembered the number of widows created by shots taken for the wrong reasons. Done, Morrison said, too fast, then slower, done. Written. Today. Before chow. Good, Thompson said. He gestured to his aide, who produced a slate in a case with edges like a ship. Second item. Orders. Your current paperwork says sniper support, Team 3. I have authority to modify. DevGru is standing up a new cadre for advanced marksmanship and decision science. I want you there, half your rotations to write doctrine that doesn't get men killed when the app freezes. Maya opened her mouth and closed it because options had always been something that happened to other people. A training billet meant stepping into light. It meant speaking in rooms where men folded their arms if they thought you had come to steal their myth. It meant owning the name instead of hiding it in a watch. Sir, Morrison said, surprising himself by interrupting correctly, with respect to cadre needs, Team 3 needs her operational. We just watched a shooter turn chaos into arithmetic. That belongs on our stack. I request assignment as lead sniper. Rodriguez didn't look away from Maya's face while the men above him threw paper at each other. He saw it, the flicker of the kid who used to shoot tin cans with her father in a desert so flat it taught you the horizon isn't a line, it's a question. He saw her inventory the parts of herself that got her here and decide which ones she wanted to keep. Third option, Thompson said, smiling like a man who had rehearsed this before bed. Dual billet. Primary, Team 3, operational. Secondary, DevGru cadre between workups. You deploy, then you teach what deployment taught you. You'll be tired. You'll be resented by the lazy. You'll be copied by the brave. It's the right kind of hard. Maya looked at Morrison. He held the look without flinching. He didn't blink an apology again, he offered a future. She looked at Rodriguez. He nodded once, a benediction from someone who had seen too many mornings turn into memorials. She looked at Chen. The intel officer gave the smallest shrug that meant you already know the answer. I accept, Maya said. On condition. She turned to the semicircle of faces that had been a jury an hour ago and were now something else. The morning dies with the afternoon. No one who walks in here after me carries that weight. Hazing is theft, of time, of skill, of trust. You want to test someone? Write a test you can pass yourself. You want to see who they are? Put them on a problem and count how many men come home. Commander, I want it in writing. It will be, Morrison said, and for the first time since dawn he sounded like a leader rather than a weather event. And when the paper isn't enough, you can remind me. The bay's speakers clicked. The range officer, who had been doing a convincing impression of a potted plant, cleared his throat. Ma'am, Sergeant, he swallowed the formality like a hot stone. About your time. We're burning a brass plaque. If you don't want your name on it, we'll just put the numbers. Maya half smiled, a fissure in granite that let light through. Put excellence has no excuses, she said. Then add the time in small type. It won't last. It won't, Rodriguez agreed, grinning like a man discovering he still knew how. Because you're going to break it again. They broke up like thunderstorms, sudden, messy, with puddles of conversation left behind. Men clapped shoulders they'd spent the morning ignoring. The youngest operators looked like their bones had grown during lunch. Chen lingered as Maya slid the rifle back into the case. For the record, the intel officer said, voice pitched for just them. I did hit record for the course. I didn't for the talk. That one belongs to you until you hand it over. Thank you, Maya said. 2 words, a dozen meanings. You know they'll call you Ghost, Chen added. Maya looked at the watch and then up through the blast glass toward the curve of ocean under the ring. They can try, she said. I'd rather they call me instructor when they're lost. By evening, Morrison had drafted a 3-page policy in plain language that would make lawyers yawn and shooters cheer. The most radical line was short: we will never again confuse humiliation with standards. He signed it. Rodriguez countersigned. Chen appended it to the training docket. Thompson sent it to the flag officers with a note that said, "We're late to this. Catch up." Maya ate alone in the mess because sometimes a new gravity requires you to test your legs in private. She laid the watch on the table beside the tray. The metal left a small circle of condensation, a wet halo. "You okay?" Rodriguez asked, sliding in across from her without waiting to be invited, because family doesn't. He set down a bowl of something green and a bottle of hot sauce with a label that looked like it had been printed on purpose for pain. "I shot 12 targets," she said. "And then the day shot back." "It does that," he said. He tipped the bottle's neck toward her tray. "Don't. This stuff was invented by men who needed to feel in control of something." She smiled without letting her eyes escape the tired. "Master Chief, are you trying to ensure my survivability or steal my rite of passage?" "Both," he said. He leaned in. "I looked," he admitted. "I tried to find you. For years. The system treats kids like inventory. It hides them when it should be hiding the men who made the paperwork. I didn't stop. I just failed. I'm sorry. I didn't want to be found," she said. "I was busy making myself smaller than the room. It's harder to hit what you can't see." She took a breath and let it out through her teeth. "I'm done being small." "Good," he said. "It never fit you." They ate. The mess clattered. The ring hummed. Somewhere a tech cursed a gasket like it had done this on purpose. Ordinary sounds are a kind of salvation. Before she slept, Maya walked the spine alone. She put her palm on the bulkhead at each hatch, the way superstitious sailors pat a ship's flank before a storm, and whispered names into the metal, men she'd never met whose lives had been brought forward in time by one man's decision and whose children had been brought forward by theirs. She didn't ask for anything. She listed, like a good quartermaster taking inventory of the day. At hatch 12 she stopped because the glass looked out over the Atlantic and the city lights crawled up the coast like bioluminescence. She raised the watch and pressed the face to the glass. The cold came right through. "Ghost," she said, "not a prayer, a report. I'm here." The ocean did what oceans do. It kept being enormous and exactly itself. She closed her eyes, and for once, when she saw the ridge, it wasn't the part where he fell. It was the part where he smiled with grit in his teeth and said, "Breathe. Then do the math." Maya Wren, Sergeant Williams, Ghost's daughter, she stood there until the station's lights flicked once to tell her it was time to let the day be finished. Chapter 3, The Choice. Paper made it real. By 0900 the next morning, the orders were edited, initialed, stamped, and uploaded to an archive that hated sentiment but couldn't avoid it. Primary assignment, Naval Special Warfare Group, Team 3, Lead Sniper. Secondary duty, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DevGRU, Advanced Marksmanship and Decision Science Cadre, rotational intervals between operational workups. Reporting liaison, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Intel, for documentation and knowledge capture. Training sponsor, Master Chief Rodriguez. Morrison posted the hazing policy on the team board and, in a gesture that told on him more than any apology, read it out loud without commentary at the morning muster. "You will challenge each other," he concluded, voice stripped of performative gravel. "You will not waste a second that belongs to the mission. If you don't know the difference, ask Sergeant Wren. If she's tired, ask me. If I don't know, ask God." Then come back with the answer written down. No one laughed. Not because the line wasn't funny. Because it wasn't a line. Maya took the day the only way it could be taken, in pieces. Piece 1, the room. Devgru had carved out a classroom that looked like a weapons locker married a graduate seminar. 3 whiteboards covered in equations about as personal as rain. A rack of rifles. A shelf full of propellers and junk from drones the sea had chewed and returned like bones. Chen stood at the back, tablet at ease, camera eye off until told otherwise. Ghostlight Doctrine, Rodriguez read off a draft header on the central board. That you? Maya grimaced. Working title. It'll get called whatever the shooters call it behind my back. Make sure it's short, Chen said. Nicknames spread better than memos. Maya uncapped a marker. The board took the ink like it had been waiting for something besides acronyms. She wrote 5 lines. 2 clocks, heart and station. Match them before you shoot. Read without batteries, microdrift, vibration, thermal plume. Confirm with tech, not the other way around. Bank the wind, gusts are rails. Ride them, don't resist them. Lead the unknown, erratic isn't random. Train your eye to see intention in noise. When not to shoot, lives are saved by restraint you can defend under oath. She turned. This is the skeleton, she said. We'll teach lungs and muscle as we go. A young petty officer with a wrestler's neck and a new baby's sleep debt raised his hand. Ma'am, he said, hesitating over the word like it had teeth. On 2 clocks, how do you teach matching the station when the station is a cave or a storm? Everything has a rhythm, Maya said. Caves breathe. Storms have a beat you can hear in your suit fabric and feel in your teeth. Stand still for 30 seconds. Count. If you can't find the rhythm, you don't fire. You relocate or you wait. The shot you don't take belongs to the men who might have to pay for it. He nodded, the idea landing like a weight his arms were ready to carry. Another hand. Ma'am, what about smart glass? It backsolves in a millisecond. Good, Maya said. Make it prove you right. You do the math first. If the glass disagrees, you check your read. If the glass still disagrees, you call someone you trust. If nobody picks up, you don't pretend certainty. You shoot center mass at 10 fewer meters than you want and you accept the miss rather than a ricochet into a kid. Silence. Then a long, low, copy. Piece 2, the range. Bay 7 this time, configured for lunar wideouts, visibility variable, dust devils simulated as ghostly curtains along the line. She set the students 2 by 2, one prone, one watching with binoculars, then switched them before resentment could grow roots. Say what you see, she told the spotters. Not what you want. Not what the app says you should. Tell him the thread you'd pull if the target were a sweater. Rodriguez drifted among them like quality control at a factory that refused to ruin you. You're doing that thing with your cheek, he told one shooter gently. You lean in like you're trying to hurry the bullet with your face. Let the barrel do the romance, son. You just keep the books. Maya took the far lane for demonstrations. She shot badly on purpose for the first 5 rounds and narrated the mistakes. See? I trusted the dust, not the vibration. I let the gust seduce me. I took a shot because I was bored with not shooting. Don't do any of that. Boredom is where career-ending decisions put on cologne. They laughed, then watched her tighten, adjust, and settle until the targets fell in a pace that felt like a story: setup, complication, answer. She finished, locked the bolt open, and looked up to find half the bay watching with their whole faces. I'm not a trick, she said, not unkindly. I'm a process you can learn. That's good news. For all of us. Piece 3, the pushback. It came in the team room, not the bay, quiet, the way dissent covers its mouth when the general is still close enough to hear. An operator with a decade's worth of salt on his boots and a row of campaign ribbons like a resume cleared his throat. "Sergeant," he said, respectfully, "our job used to be simpler. Put eyes on threat, take the shot. All this, when not to, it sounds like we're asking to be Monday morning quarterbacked by someone who hasn't been on the glass." Maya listened without nodding, because nodding can be read as agreement you don't own. "If it feels like that," she said, "I failed to brief the point. When not to is not a lawyer's idea of war. It's a shooter's. On the ridge my father died on, there were 4 shots he didn't take. 2 because wind turned friendly for a heartbeat and pushed the wrong way. 1 because the target's shadow showed a second shooter waiting for a muzzle flash. 1 because he couldn't confirm that the movement wasn't a goat herder's kid. Those 4 restraint calls saved 8 men. The burst he did take bought the rest of their time. I'm not telling you to hesitate. I'm telling you to carry one more tool, permission to pass." Rodriguez added, "And if anyone in a room later says you were timid, send them to me. I'll show them the graves we dug for shots that shouldn't have been taken." The operator's shoulders unclenched. He wasn't arguing principle, he was arguing fear of being left alone with the consequence. Maya gave him something better. "We codify it," she said. "We write down 10 scenarios we'll all face and the last 3 times we handled them. We'll put names on those decisions, mine included. We learn in public. Not to shame, to shorten the next guy's learning curve." He nodded once, deciding it was ridiculous and good at the same time, exactly the kind of idea that works. Piece 4, The Visit. General Thompson stopped by late, as men do when they want to see if their decisions are still good in afternoon light. He stood in the doorway while Maya and Chen edited footage into a form that looked like instruction and not worship. "Regrets?" he asked. "Only that it took this long," Maya said. "Not for me. For the pipeline." He glanced at the board. "Bank the Wind is going to make colonels frown into their coffee," he said. "I like it." "Let them frown," Chen said. "We'll feed them the numbers. The numbers always win." "Sometimes," Thompson said. "Sometimes the narrative eats the numbers for breakfast." "Then we starve the narrative," Maya said. "With proof." He smiled, less hawk now, more teacher. "You have ops on deck." Morrison appeared with uncanny timing, as if summoned by the word. "Raid package," he said, handing over a thin folder whose pages had been sweated on by 4 different hands already. "Dark site outside Shackleton. Thermal plumes, no atmosphere to cheat with, communication scalloped by rim geometry. If the target breathes, ghost light will find it." Maya felt the small resistance inside, the part of her that had spent years avoiding stages, fold itself into something else. This was not a stage. It was a problem. Problems are holy if you let them be. "When?" she asked. "Wheels up in 36, Morrison said. "Brief in 12. "Then cut the brief to 10, she said, "and give me 2 to look at their dust model." "It's wrong." Chen tried not to smile and failed. "Of course it is." Piece 5, The Quiet. That night, when bays went dark and the galley had only the hum of dishwashers for company, Maya took a sheet of legal pad and wrote a letter she would never send. "Dear Dad. I used your name today. They gave it back to me like a folded flag, and I didn't know whether to salute or throw up. I chose to eat and teach and write policy, because grief is just another word for unspent effort and I'm tired of saving it. You were right about the math. It still works. It's uglier now, more variables, more men with apps and less with calluses, but gravity is stubborn and so is a good sight picture. Also, your watch still gains 2 seconds a day. I could get it fixed. I won't. It's our secret drift. Tomorrow we go to the moon to make sure a bad man doesn't get to be a story someone tells to justify worse. The commander who mocked me this morning signed a policy that will protect kids who aren't here yet. The Master Chief who lived because you decided to die ate dinner with me and tried to feed me poison disguised as hot sauce. An intel officer with a face that could be a poem recorded my worst and best minutes and asked permission to keep them safe for later. If you had lived, you would have liked them all. You would have found the one flaw they hide and put your thumb on it gently until they laughed and it let go. If I don't come back, I want someone to know why we went, not for medals, not for revenge, for the math that says 8 families laughing at a dinner table is a better equation than 1. If I do, I'll keep teaching until even the stupid clocks learn the right time. Forever watching. Maya. She folded the page and slid it beneath the watch on her bunk as if paper could anchor metal. She set an alarm for far too early and slept in a posture her body had taught itself during years of being the smallest thing in hostel rooms, one hand open, one hand closed, heart angled toward the door. Outside, the ring turned. The Atlantic glittered like a mess hall floor after inspection. The Bay 7 targets slept without dreams. In a different orbit, the Shackleton Rim threw a long shadow across cold ground. Morning would come with briefs, with checklists, with a commander who was trying to become a man his brother would recognize, with a Master Chief who'd stand behind her without breathing like a good wall, with an intel officer who'd whisper the parts the map had missed. Maya would shoulder the rifle, kiss the watch with a thumb, and go find the next hard thing. The choice was made. Now came the work. Chapter 4, Proving Ground. The moon doesn't have air to carry mistakes away. What you do there sits in the silence with you. Briefing room, 1,100 hours. The Shackleton package fit inside a folder that shouldn't have been able to hold that much risk. Lieutenant Chen flipped to the thermal page and tapped the rim map. Dark sight burrowed into the shadow just off Shackleton Crater. Corporate mercs, no flag, no laws except the ones they brought. Objective: recover a stolen lattice core before it leaves the suborbital window and disappears into a private warehouse chain we can't touch. Defenses? Morrison asked, voice workmanlike now. The theater had burned off him overnight. Passive: horizon-low sensor nets and a jammer mast that climbs on demand. Chen slid a second sheet free. Active: for remote sentry guns tuned for suit heat signatures and 2 human shooters, probably ex-mil, on a radiator's catwalk. No atmosphere, so no wind. But you'll get thermal plumes off the vents and regolith fog when they cycle heat. Maya underlined regolith fog and plumes. 2 clocks, this time, neither beat like a heart. One belonged to the site's heat cycles, the other to the moon itself, slow, indifferent fall. Insertion, 0400. The shuttle skated in the black like it owed someone money. The crater's shadow was a blade. They flew along the edge of it until the pilot threw the craft sideways and kissed a ridge that looked like dust shaped into a thought. The ramp dropped. Silence punched their suit mics. Silence doesn't echo. Boots met powder that behaved like memory, clinging even when you told it not to. 1/6 gravity made everything a polite argument. Men who carried 70 pounds like a religion felt briefly forgiven. The forgiveness ended as soon as the first micrometeorite stitch sparked against a far boulder and reminded them that the sky had teeth. Ghost light, take high, Morrison said on the tack net, voice flat, clipped. No more performative gravel. Commands that didn't lean on you to stand. Maya moved like a number solving itself, gliding from rock lip to carved berm with a rhythm her brain had learned during hours in a variable G-bay, heart rate easing toward the slower drum of a place where falling was mostly just drifting with intent. The M700X lay across her forearms, the coil's capacitors hummed at a frequency she could feel in the bones of her jaw, not here. No air meant no bullet song, no muzzle report. Only the firm click of a bolt and the coil's internal catchunk, like a fist hitting a padded door inside your ear. The facility's radiator trees rose out of the dark like frozen fireworks, spidery veins designed to bleed waste heat into space. From each vein, if you watched long enough, a haze would lift and drift in slow curtains, sublimed ice, gases burped from systems they'd pushed too hard. Plumes instead of wind. She marked their rhythm, 28 seconds strong, 22 weaker, then a long exhale as a secondary loop kicked in. 2 clocks. Jammer mast, Chen said, perfectly calm. You'll have 30-second windows between its climbs. It up-downs like a nervous kid. Copy, Maya said. She reached, thumb brushed the watch out of habit, and the engraving pressed cold against her suit glove. Forever watching. The words felt almost literal with the stars so close. They crossed a shallow basin and the world punished them for moving. The first remote gun woke, a pinprick diamond flashing as it rotated to the warmest blobs on the field, 2 operators whose radiators ran hot because they'd rushed the pre-brief checks. The sentry spat tungsten at a rate that would have embarrassed a thunderstorm if storms had pride. It chewed their cover like stale bread. Down. Morrison barked. 2, you're loud, cut your thermal. Then, sane enough to split tasks, Ghostlight, you seeing that catwalk shooter? I see 2, she said. One knelt behind a radiator fin, patient, letting his target present. The other had made himself a silhouette against a prismatic panel, greedily looking for hero shots. She could have taken him, easy. When not to shoot. The radiant panel sat above a line of cryo-tanks. A miss, unlikely, but math hates arrogance, could punch a valve and turn a rooftop into a shrapnel factory. The plume patterned a few meters over his left shoulder, though, that was a different story. Stand by on catwalk, she said. She scrolled elevation down 6 clicks, not because gravity demanded it, it was kind here, but because she was about to use air that wasn't there. The radiator vent sighed, a vapor bloom like a ghost scarf. She fired not at the man, but through the newborn streamer where the coil slip and the plume's gentle push would bend a tungsten flechette by exactly the arc needed to clip the mast's coupling. The coil punched. The world held its breath. The jammer mast shuddered midway through a climb, spun a lazy circle, and locked at a useless 90 degrees. Chen's voice jumped half a shade. Comms clean. Nice. 2, 3, push left, Morrison said. Sentries 1 and 2 retasking. Ghostlight. On it. She took the first sentry's optic, smaller target than the gun, but a clean way to make a machine go blind without spraying hazardous shrapnel back at your friends. The second spat before she could line it, round sparking off the basalt lip a meter from her boot. She slid, not back, but sideways, low G lets you choose your mistakes, and tossed a cloud of regolith with her knee. The dust hung like guilt. In that suspended fog, she saw something wrong, a lane too clean, an arc too smooth. Decoys. Heat shrouds on simple rods, planted to lure shots away from the real bodies tucked into regolith hollows. The mercs had budget and a veteran's sense of humor. Hold your fire on obvious, she said, and 3 rifles that had already been halfway through a squeeze arrested themselves like men hit a millisecond before they steal. Shoot at the edges of wrong. See that hollow, 7 o'clock, 9 meters low, looks like a dent. That's not a dent. Rodriguez, on her left by 20 meters and a lifetime, chuckled softly over the net. On your call. His shot dug into the dent, a thin scream of vented suit air glittered as a man who hadn't believed in restraint learned physics too late. A second plume went bright along the radiator trunk, cycle spiked. They're cooking themselves, Chen said. Push to the door on that. Negative, Maya said, watching where the plume would be, not where it was. In 5 seconds there's going to be a fog wall. We go in blind, their trained dogs make us pay. We wait 5, we walk on a carpet. Morrison held. He didn't used to. He did now. 5 seconds stretched like old taffy, the plume blew and the regolith lifted in a moving curtain you could hide a squad in. Move, he said, and Team 3 flowed like language. They hit the first lock with a textbook breach that would make training videos purr. Inside, the world found sound again, vibrations in metal, bulkheads singing. Maya took a knee at the interior gallery and scanned a corridor where emergency lights painted everything in shipwreck red. A figure stumbled into the crosshairs, small, carrying something bulky. When not to shoot showed its teeth. The something looked like a pressure mender, not a weapon. The suit bore a red stripe that had meant medic in a dozen armies. "Hold," she said, even though nobody had fired yet. "Red stripe. Let them pass." The figure looked up, froze at the guns, then kept moving, hands high, the pack bouncing like a heart. She felt her pulse climb and forced it down to the slow, bored beat that balls-out math requires. Second intersection, a merc with a smart glass shotgun, scope up, face hard. She took his optic, then his shoulder, deliberately dirty, forcing him to drop not bleed out. He screamed. It helped. The rest skittered backward like bugs when you lift a rock. "Core package," Chen said in their ears. "Third bay, center rack. If they saw us kill the mast, they're prepping to scuttle." "On me," Morrison said. "Ghost light, eyes." "Catwalk high is cold, but floor 2 is hotter than a temper," she said. "Someone's dumping heat into a fake signature to draw you. Real shooter is tucked right where the cold should be." "How do you," the Master Chief started, stopped. "Right, you smell lies." "Copy," Morrison said, and they took the stairwell with a speed you only learn after you've practiced not dying more times than you can count. In Bay 3, the lattice cord glowed behind a mesh like a small captured aurora. Two mercs turned with movements too smooth to be afraid. Maya put one down at the elbow, the other at the knee. "Live intel," she said into the quiet, because it was important to say it out loud. "Charges," someone hissed. "Not if you want to keep breathing," Maya said. She pointed to a pipe that wasn't a pipe. "That's a feed line to a tank that will treat us to a lesson in explosive decompression if you poke it because you're excited." She took a breath, allowed herself a single beat of pride that didn't calcify into vanity, and then got small again. "Morrison, let me kill the last sentry through the radiator seam. If I miss, you can write policy that bans me from adjectives." "Take the seam," he said. She went prone on the catwalk, the coils simmering under her cheek, and waited through 3 plume cycles so her body knew the rhythm down to the finger. On the 4th, the vapor wall snapped and, for a blink, the seam between fins revealed a sliver of sentry optic. She breathed out the way her father had taught her, empty until you feel the floor, and touched the trigger. The flechette slid through the seam, clipped circuitry, and killed the gun so gently it could have been a mercy. The sentry sighed itself sideways and went still. Outside, the stars kept being stars. Inside, Team 3 pulled the lattice core free and sealed the bay with a discipline that had learned from too many closed-casket funerals. Extraction was math and sweat. On the ramp, Morrison keyed his mic and forgot to sound like a legend. "Team 3 to damn neck. Package is ours. Casualties light. Property damage constrained." And, he stopped, then did it right. "And we did it without shooting at the wrong problems. Ghostlight, you carry." "Shared carry," she said. "Nobody shoots alone." Back at the ring, the debrief wasn't a victory lap. They ran mistakes like drills until even the good shots learned to taste their flaws. Chen archived, Rodriguez annotated, Morrison signed his own name to 2 errors and the policy's first update: no shot through critical infrastructure without 2 independent reads, one of them human. Small line. Big shadow. Maya walked the spine again that night and did not write a letter. She pressed the watch to the bulkhead and let the cold decide what she remembered. It gave her a split-second image of a man in dust, not dying this time, but teaching his daughter how to stand around a rifle until the world came to her instead of the other way around. The moon kept its silence. Her bones kept the rhythm she'd borrowed from it. She slept without dreaming. Chapter 5, Doctrine, written in heat. A plaque is just metal until someone believes it. Then it gets heavy. They mounted it on Bay 9's bulkhead between the hazard chart and the first aid kit where hands would see it without meaning to. Excellence has no excuses. For 17, underneath in smaller type, so small you had to lean in, count the lives, not the likes. GW. No mention of gender. No mention of politics. A sentence that worked like a carpenter's square against sloppy arguments. The week after Shackleton became a calendar of circles that looked like monotony from a distance and like revolution when you stood inside them. Morning doctrine sessions. Lunch on your feet, not because anyone was punishing you but because hunger learned to move. Afternoon range. Evening knowledge capture, where Chen sorted, tagged, and turned the day into something you could read when your hands were still shaking. Morrison took to publishing the day's plan at 0500 with a note at the bottom that said, simply, standards of style. It read like a man building himself step by step. He moved men from their comfort lanes, blind dated quiet shooters with loud ones until the pairs took on each other's better habits. He instituted blind eval blocks where shooters were graded by number alone. An operator who'd spent his career living on charm and volume discovered his shots were average when no one knew the name attached. He worked until average hurt less and the score stopped needing him to explain it. Rodriguez ran a parallel track, restraint drills. The first iteration was a disaster on purpose. The sim threw a dozen alleyways worth of problems at them, a target masked by a reflective surface that mirrored heat, a civilian with a metal cane that read like a weapon, a hostage whose panic looked exactly like an assault until you watched her hands. There are 100 ways to be wrong, the Master Chief said, patient as bedrock. And one way to be right. We will build the one. Maya taught more than shooting. She taught looking. Your scope is a story you're writing about a stranger, she said to a room where coffee had replaced blood in too many veins. Your job is not to make it dramatic. Your job is to make it true. She laid out misreads she'd made and what they had cost. She showed video of Shackleton where she'd gone to the optic too early and missed the tell in the regolith fog. She slowed the footage down until the mistake was as big as a billboard and uglier. This is mine, she said, marker tapping the screen. I keep it. You can borrow it so you don't pay for the same lesson. Chen watched men, and 2 women, new faces, brand new assignments signed under Thompson's suddenly popular authority, lean into the ugly without flinching. She recorded as much as permission allowed, then took the parts no camera could hold and turned them into words precise enough to survive a courtroom, a congressional hearing, a widow's questions. Midweek, Morrison walked into the bay carrying a case like a man bearing bread. He opened it with hands that didn't tremble. Inside, a dozen watches, faces clean, bands simple. The engraving plate lay beside them. He didn't make a speech. He said, I can't write your initials for you, and stepped back. Later, alone at a workbench, Maya guided the plate under the cutter and watched the tiny bit carve MW, forever watching into a face she would give to a kid someday who had no business still being alive, and every business still being alive. Resistance didn't vanish because 2 good days happened. It got sneaky. A senior operator with a mind like a bear trap argued that blind eval ignored intangibles, by which he meant the way men listen differently when a charismatic shooter called wind. Maya let him run the argument until it winded itself, then showed him his own groupings plotted against heart rate. Your intangibles rise when your pulse spikes, she said softly. That's adrenaline selling you stock you can't afford. He stared at the paper as if it had written him. He signed up for extra sessions without saying the word sorry and made up for it with sweat. 2 days later, the not shooting test left the lab. A maintenance bruise on a supply shuttle at the Norfolk orbital ladder escalated into a boarding scare when a panicked deckhand waved a pry bar like a rifle. 2 security drones woke, misread, and splayed beams across a viewing window. Maya had no jurisdiction there, no badge. She had a radio, a voice, and a doctrine that didn't need a permission slip. Stand down, she told the nearest drone operator, a kid with a face that was going to figure out regret if someone didn't take the weight out of his hands. You don't have sightline confirm and you're about to shoot a man who's trying to unlatch a stuck clamp with a tool. Put your finger on your pulse. Count to 10. If you can't, call someone who can. He called her. She counted him down. The clamp gave. The window held. The story died small on page 4 where it belonged. That same afternoon, Rodriguez walked her past the range plaque and tapped the small line under the time. "You write that?" "I borrowed it," she said. "From a man who wrote better under fire." "Then borrow this, too," he said, and handed her an envelope that looked like it had been opened and closed a dozen times by someone who couldn't decide whether to be brave. Inside, a letter on paper with a floral watermark you couldn't see unless you were the sort of person who noticed that kind of thing. Jennifer Morrison. A few paragraphs. Not poetry. Not sentiment. Gratitude square and heavy as a brick. He came home. He tucked them in. They are loud teenagers now. Thank you for letting the story about my husband be a good one. Maya stood by the hazard chart and let the letter sit against her sternum like armor. She didn't cry. Not because she was tough. Because the body sometimes keeps the good water for when it's dark. Toward week's end, Thompson called in from a conference room where the wood had to be fake but looked expensive. "Your doctrine write-up is already blurred by hands," he said. "That's a compliment. Also, be ready for the first questions that will pretend they're about funding but are about fear." "What's the fear?" Maya asked. "That if we evaluate on performance alone, the men who live on story will have to learn to live on skill," Thompson said. "Our job is to show them that's not a demotion. It's a promotion to reality." Morrison, listening in, surprised himself by adding, "Tell them I'm the before picture. And that the after is better." The general laughed, a sound with edges but no cruelty. "Send me that line. I might need it." On the last night before another deployment cycle began, Bay 9 was empty before midnight for the first time in weeks. Maya took the lane closest to the plaque and set up the M700X with a ritual that had lost none of its meaning from repetition. She didn't load. She just lay behind the glass and breathed her clocks into alignment, the stations hum a little faster than her heart now that she knew how to slow herself without violence. She thought about her students, faces in various stages of losing their certainty and finding something better. She thought about Morrison writing policy after lights out because he understood that some debts earn interest nightly. She thought about Chin cataloging the day with a tenderness that never showed. She thought about Rodriguez's hand on her shoulder when she'd almost taken a shot she didn't need earlier that afternoon, and the way his palm had said. She set the watch on the rubber mat beside the rifle, engraving up, and traced the letters with her glove. Past the glass, the Atlantic slid under the ring as if Earth had decided to pretend it was simple for a few hours. On her way out, she stopped at the plaque and, with a black marker, added a dot under the last word. Not changing the sentence. Completing it. A period like a promise. Outside the bay, an operator she'd been hard on 2 days ago waited as if by accident. He had the posture of someone trying not to be formal and failing. "Sergeant," he said. "About Tuesday. You were right. I was framing a shot to make a point." "And?" she asked, no heat. "And I didn't take it," he said. "I heard your stupid permission to pass in my head and I passed. We cleared the room. Nobody had to write a letter to a wife. He stopped, shook his head, and tried a different tack. "Thanks." "Write it down," she said. "Not the thanks. The scenario. The miss you chose. Someone else will need it." He nodded like a man signing a treaty with himself. "Will do." Back in her quarters, she placed the watch on the shelf where the legal pad letter had slept the week before and turned out the light. The ring murmured. The kind of tired that belongs to good days put weight on her limbs. Maya lay on her side, one hand open, one hand closed, heart angled toward the door. She didn't dream. She didn't need to. The day had done enough dreaming on her behalf. In the morning, there would be new lanes, new kids with old fears, new men who had decided their names mattered less than their groups. The doctrine would change again because good doctrine does when the world hands it a better problem set. The watch would gain its 2 seconds and she wouldn't fix it. The plaque would hang there, cheap and heavy, and someone, today or next year or after she'd rotated out and the bay had forgotten the shape of her breath, would read it at the right moment and make a decision that kept the stranger alive. That would be enough. That had to be enough. Chapter 6, The Hesitation They Paid For. The Norfolk orbital ladder rose like a harp string into the morning haze. Under it, the city was already hot enough to make the air wobble. Reflected light off water made everyone look a little ghostly, as if the bay were auditioning faces and couldn't decide which to keep. Short brief, long day, Chen said, pointer tapping the rendering that hung above the table. Transfer node C, Charlie Doc, reports a sabotage event. Unknown actors seized a maintenance gallery spanning 3 spokes and the radial concourse. 63 civilians trapped in the food court and along the commuter belt. Threats claim they'll drop a gift if we breach. The gift appears to be an ammonia ballast canister they've unseated from the thermal loop. Anhydrous, Rodriguez murmured. A breath is a burn. Correct, Chen said. Worse, the ring's emergency shutters are offline. Our adversaries know the maintenance schematics. Inside help, or they've bought manuals. Either way, air's the fuse, panic is the powder. Morrison stood with the posture of a man who had learned how to carry weight evenly. Non-lethal if possible, surgical if we must, he said. We aren't here to be dramatic, we're here to end the story. Maya traced the station's cross-section with her eyes, 3 spokes, a concourse, a curving belt walkway, centrifugal gravity rising with distance from the axis. She heard 2 clocks again, station and heart, the latter's hum a steady 8th note, her pulse willing itself to quarter. Insertion came sideways by necessity, a maintenance lift no one used unless something had already gone wrong. Gravity felt indecisive near the axis, light steps that made heavy gear feel like lies. The closer they slid to the concourse, the more weight returned, a persuasion you could feel in your knees. The riot of a food court under duress is an anthropology lab. People clumped around power outlets. Children slept like small revolutions. A man with a bloody ear insisted he was fine. A woman whispered to a child in 2 languages at once, as if a third might arrive in time to help. Shadowed at the far end, 5 figures in cheap exos might as well have been billboards for a bad decision. Their helmets gleamed corporate sleek, their rifles looked rented, their lines were wrong. Professionals don't stand like they're waiting for applause. Rules of engagement, Morrison said on the net, tone tight but calm. Ghostlight calls the shots. If she says hold, you hold. There was a moment, brief, but present, when you could feel 16 men decide what those words meant to them. Then it passed. It had to. The crew chief of the node, eyes too wide, met Chen by a pillar and talked in gasps. They used our own lockouts, he said. Pulled isolation pins from the shutters, spoofed pressure sensors, rerouted thermal cycling. Security drones flagged them as maintenance actions because the tags were valid. They knew to wear the right badges. Badges can be bought, Chen said, with a gentleness that made the man believe her. You didn't invite this. Maya lay prone behind a planter that pretended to be a citrus tree and watched the EXO team through a lattice of leaves that smelled like someone had cut summer into pieces. The nearest gunman's visor reflected the Jumbotron's loop of silent public service announcements. In the corner of that reflection, a child's sneaker sole, trembling under a bench. When not to shoot, the doctrine whispered. The shot would pass through the visor, then the man's head, then the acrylic panel beyond, then into panic. She'd trained her finger to understand that mathematics can be morally neutral, decisions cannot. Copy 5 primary threats, Maya said, steady. 2 more likely behind the vendor stalls. 1 on the catwalk above concessions with a drone control pad. Their ammonia canister is hanging by a single strap from the radial truss, they've cut the safety cleats. Any discharge in this place turns to lye. Can you disable the canister from here? Morrison asked. Yes, Maya said. And kill 6 civilians with a ricochet if I'm lucky. No. She scoped the ceiling. Heavy condensation beaded around a band of chilled pipes, dripping into troughs that fed the planters. Gravity gradient meant drips arced. The arc had a rhythm. Bank the wind became bank the water. She did the math without a pen: droplet mass, fall time, belt speed, pipe temperature. A stupid, beautiful solution arrived like a bird that didn't belong indoors. "Master Chief," she said. "I need 2 foam cannons from the fire wall at 4 o'clock, 1 to me. Chen, can we backcycle the thermal loop to spike condensation in Sector B? Flood the air with clean water for 60 seconds. Chen's eyebrows lifted, then slid down in thought. "It'll trip alarms. The node will think there's a leak." "Good," Maya said. "We want them looking up." Morrison didn't ask how a rainstorm could be a tactic. "Do it," he said. The overhead went from sheen to shower in 15 seconds. Water came down like a rumor everyone believed at once. The crowd gasped, the Exo men cursed and raised their rifles to protect optics that weren't designed to serve as umbrellas. In that one beat of reflex, the drone operator looked up, too, and that was the mistake that made the difference. "Now," Maya said. 2 foam cannons thumped and hurled their white veils across the concourse. The drones choked. The nearest gunman took a step into slick and had the cartoon banana peel moment that would save a life later. Maya's first shot wasn't at a person. She severed the strap holding the ammonia canister and the concourse inhaled as a group. It fell toward a net of foam and shoppers and small gods. It did not land. Rodriguez, who had lurked exactly where she needed him, lunged out from cover with a cargo hook on a composite line, snagged the canister's neck like he was roping a steer under a circus tent, and swung it into a maintenance cradle that had been empty for 5 years. The cradle caught with a groan that sounded like 2 old men agreeing at last. "Lock it," Maya said. "Locked," Rodriguez grunted. "Now I'd like to never do that again." "Copy," she said, and turned her attention to the men who still imagined themselves the main characters. The Exo lead recovered fast, credit to training. He yanked a canister from his belt and palmed it toward the food court, babbling about gifts. Maya tracked the arc for a shot she didn't want but would take, and then something else moved where motion had no right to be, a toddler, resolved into existence beneath the throw, chasing an orange ball that had rolled from beneath a table into the open. "Hold," she said, because there are words that make men immortal. Half the team flinched, their fingers still. The canister hit tile, bounced, rolled, and settled against a drain. It hissed like a snake losing a bet. Foam bored into its mouth, the hiss choked and died. "Permission to pass," the charismatic shooter whispered, voice a dry laugh shaken into being by adrenaline. "God help me, I passed." "You lived," Maya said. "God will have to be okay with that." The Exo lead switched to Plan C, which was always going to be ugly: grab a hostage and improvise. He had a boy by the collar and a muzzle against a jaw before the nearest father could move, before any team member could accelerate their careful into reckless. The boy's eyes were the color of bad weather. Maya set the reticle where it couldn't lie to her, on the gunman's right wrist, a hand's breadth above the radial artery. She breathed until her chest forgot the word urgency. Then she did something no doctrine can write: she waited an extra half-second, not to aim, but to be sure this was the shot she wanted to live with. The world didn't notice her bargain. The man shifted. She pressed. The flechette shattered the Exo glove's armor, punched bone, and turned the man's fingers into cotton. The pistol fell, clanged, spun. The boy ran the way children run in dreams, through molasses and angels, until he hit a woman who became a fortress around him. Morrison and 2 others folded the lead into tile. The remaining Exos raised hands with the speed of people learning what it feels like to want survival more than dignity. "Clear," Rodriguez said, and his voice made the word honest. It would have been nice if that were the last note. It wasn't. On the catwalk, another figure had been waiting with a different plan, to use the chaos to shoot into the foam and claim that an operator fired first. The weapon wasn't right. The optics were wrong. The stance had catalog elegance. Maya saw it and had to fight muscle memory that wanted to take the shot that rightness allowed. "Hold," she said, and walked her scope 3 meters left to a black dome no one was looking at. Dome, third-party security cam. Manufacturer, Halcyon. Lens firmware, famously hackable. She took the lens. It popped into powder. "Chen," she said. "I see it," Chen answered, already inside an admin panel on a side console. Someone was feeding a SEAL Fires First narrative to external monitors. Third-party contractor with an R&D lab in Reston. They preloaded an overlay. If we'd shot that plant, headlines would have written themselves. "Pull the logs," Maya said. "Already printing," Chen said. "The printer's out of paper. I'm printing to 3 cooking receipts and a child's coloring sheet." They exfiltrated through a lane of civilians that had figured out gratitude is louder when you're alive. A woman caught Maya's sleeve and whispered a thank you in a language Maya didn't know. The tone translated. The boy with bad weather eyes clutched his orange ball and stared at the watch on Maya's wrist as if it were a light that decided not to blind him. Back at the ring, the debrief was a layered cake: tactical review, narrative armor, legal triage. The after-action bore a line none of them wanted to write but all of them were glad to have: operator declined a permitted shot, outcome improved. Morrison signed his name next to it in cramped block letters that had looked the same when he was 19. The footage Chen salvaged from the hacked camera reached the right desks in the wrong city. The contractor's logo blurred in the hands of people who thought procurement was a kind of weather. Within 24 hours, a memo arrived laced with threat: "Your restraint policy may have endangered civilians. Prepare to defend hesitation at the flag panel." "Here it comes," Rodriguez said, cleaning a rifle that didn't need it. "Good," Maya said, surprising them both. "Let's talk about the price of not thinking." She slept badly for the first time in weeks, not because the day had been wrong, but because a new kind of fight had stepped from the concourse into a room with carpet and microphones. You can't bank wind in a hearing room. You bank your breath instead and hope it translates. Before dawn she walked past Bay 9 and touched the plaque, "Excellence has no excuses," and added, under her breath, "and no apology for mercy." The watch gained its 2 seconds. She left it that way on purpose. The ladder hummed overhead, a clock you could trust. Her heart listened and kept time. Chapter 7, The Panel and the Porch. Washington wears its storms in suits. The building where the flag panel sat was all glass that pretended it could keep weather out. In the anteroom, a bowl of stale peppermints waited beside a sign that said "Closed Session" as if secrecy were a snack. Chen slid a folder across to Maya. "Evidence," she said. "Video from Norfolk. Overlay spoof logs. Thermal differentials proving you triggered condensation. A copy of Morrison's policy. The coloring sheet we printed the admin log onto, because I thought the absurdity might help." Morrison arrived in dress whites that fit like pennants. He adjusted his cover once and then pretended he hadn't. Rodriguez wore a suit that made him look like a boulder in court. He had left the hot sauce at home. "Ground rules," Chen said, shifting into the version of herself that could thread a needle with a subpoena. "Answer what you're asked. Don't volunteer. If they ask you to speculate, say, 'I don't have enough data.' If they ask you to apologize for a life you saved, smile like you're thinking about your grandchildren and give them numbers." "Copy," Maya said. Inside, the dais held 3 flags and 4 men with faces that had learned to look serious for a living. A woman with a JAG badge sat at the end, eyes bright, pen ready. The chair cleared his throat in a way that suggested he was about to clear something else. "Sergeant Williams," he said. "You've been very busy. The panel seeks to understand whether the so-called restraint doctrine introduced at Dam Neck is compatible with the need for decisive action in time-sensitive scenarios. We have reports, some glowing, some alarming. Your policy author, Commander Morrison, is present. Your training sponsor, Master Chief Rodriguez, as well. Lieutenant Chen in Intelligence. We appreciate your time. Let's begin. They began the way panels do, by circling the part they wanted to bite. They showed a clipped video of the Norfolk concourse. Someone had edited it to remove the drone operator's visor, the child sneaker, the hissing canister. It looked like a rainstorm and a pause. Why did you hesitate? The chair asked. Because a child was under the arc of a thrown canister, Maya said. Because firing at a moving explosive in a wet crowd is a story with endings I won't write. Because our foam team could suffocate the device without a bullet. Because hesitation is a tool, not a sin. One of the flags leaned forward. You cannot always see the child. No, she said. So we build habits that default to checking before we shoot. We time those checks. We teach men to count their own pulse when their brain lies. We pair every shooter with a spotter whose job includes saying, wait, without being punished for it. Punished how? The flag asked, too quick. By being called cowardly, Morrison said, voice even. By missing the next mission. By being hazed to teach obedience to ego instead of to the mission. That's over. He didn't look at Maya when he said it. He looked at himself. I saw what I was. We're done with that. Another flag, younger, flicked a glance at Chen. Lieutenant, these logs, third-party vendor spoofing a camera feed to make our operators look reckless? Correct, Chen said. I have packet traces, file hashes, and the coloring sheet. She held it up. The room couldn't help itself, it smiled. A dragon in purple crayon, under a login with administrative privileges. The jag at the end scribbled faster. And the vendor's motive? Procurement, Chen said. They sell an autonomous engagement platform. It performs best when humans are made to look worst. You're saying you were set up, the chair said, not quite masking the skepticism. I'm saying their marketing plan included making our doctrine untenable, Chen said. That plan failed because a shooter saw a child, a Master Chief caught a falling poison, and rain fell on command. That's not luck. That's training in command climate. Master Chief, a flag said, as if the two words explained themselves. How long have you been training people not to shoot? Rodriguez smiled, and the smile made him more dangerous. Since my first funeral, he said. I started writing it down last month. Maya spoke when asked, and sometimes when she wasn't. She refused to be righteous. She stuck to the numbers. Shots not taken that saved X, shots taken that cost Y, average group tightening under stress after structured breathing, incident rates at ranges with published criteria versus ranges run on vibe. She said we even when it was I. The panel didn't change its posture. But posture is a performance, breath is the truth. Their questions slowed. Their pens did, too. Halfway through, the door at the back cracked open. A civilian stepped in with the tentative boldness of someone sure she would be asked to leave and ready not to. The sergeant at the wall stood to redirect her. The chair lifted a hand. 10 minutes recess, he said, surprising himself. Then we continue. They continued, but not the way anyone planned. The woman sat in the second row and waited her turn as if the room belonged to her. When the chair finally asked who she was, she stood. Jennifer Morrison, she said. Widow of Petty Officer Second Class Daniel Morrison. It's a risk to bring ghosts into rooms that pretend they don't believe in them. But she didn't bring a ghost. She brought a photograph, Danny, young and luminous, kids on either knee, a woman beside him who had learned to smile with uncertainty. She told the panel a story they already knew from reports and letters and memorial plaques. Then she told them a different one, about a late night in a kitchen where grief was a new language, and a man in dress blues with eyes like bad weather stood quiet in her doorway and said, I wanted to say thank you to the person who paid the balance on my life. She looked at Morrison, Commander, not brother, and nodded. He had to sit back to stay upright. My son couldn't be here, she said, because he has finals in calculus. My daughter is mad at me for being late to lunch. These are the disasters that fill my house because a Marine sniper made math out of a nightmare and put my husband back in my car. Today, someone's child is mad about lunch because Sergeant Williams counted to 3. She held up the coloring sheet because life has a sense of humor. And because somebody printed a log on a dragon. Room temperature can change when people tell the truth. The HVAC kept doing its job. But the air felt different. The chair cleared his throat for the 3rd time, a hat trick. This panel does not make doctrine, he said. We are not in the business of poetry. We are charged with oversight. He looked at his colleagues and found them where he'd hoped they'd be. Our preliminary finding is that the damn neck restraint doctrine does not constitute hesitation that endangers life. It constitutes professional judgment under codified standards. We will recommend its adoption across relevant commands, with training and evaluation metrics attached. He paused. Sergeant, there will be men who use your name when they don't mean your work. There will be people who try to sell your doctrine in tidy boxes. We trust you'll make that difficult. I can be difficult, Maya said. We noticed, he said, and let himself smile. The porch wasn't a literal porch. It was the observation deck outside Bay 9 that faced east. Operators called it a porch because it was where you went when the day had been bigger than your clothes and you needed air that hadn't already been inside somebody else. The rail was solid. The view was a god trick. They gathered there at dusk without texting to plan it. Morrison with sleeves rolled once, policy edits on his phone he didn't open. Rodriguez with 2 paper cups and something in them that might have been coffee or penance. Chen with a copy of a recommendation memo she didn't show anyone yet because gifts are better when they're unwrapped in daylight. Panel? Rodriguez asked. Recommended adoption, Chen said. Metrics. Funding for training. An audit of third-party vendor access to security infrastructure. A line that says excellence has no excuses in a footnote that will make half the colonels sneeze. Morrison huffed. Say it to my face if it makes you itch, he said to the invisible colonels, then softened. I was wrong in public for a long time. I can handle other people's rashes. Maya set the watch on the rail. It ticked a lie, 2 seconds fast. It feels like we won something, she said. But I don't trust feelings. You don't have to, Rodriguez said. Trust the work. It keeps going. It did. The next cycle brought in 3 new candidates, 2 men with eyes that had learned humility the hard way, 1 woman who moved like a sentence that already knew where to put its period. The bay filled with the sound of bolts and breath and arguments that stopped being about ego halfway through the first week. On the far wall, next to the plaque with the time, a second line appeared in paint that looked like it had been borrowed from a cargo stencil. Permission to pass is not permission to fail. They ran a night op that wasn't supposed to be hard and was. A scout team went quiet in the Anacostia floodplain while tagging a smuggling route. The doctrine held, not perfectly, never that, but enough. A new shooter spotted a boy under a tarp and held. A veteran who had once lived on style called wind for the rookie and said, wait, with pride. The team brought the scouts back because 3 men had learned to be less impressive. Afterward, in the bay, Maya lined up 6 watches on a rubber mat. The engraver's bit whined like a mosquito with purpose. She etched initials she didn't own. She ran a thumb over forever watching and checked herself for the small, dangerous pride that can come disguised as gratitude. She let gratitude in, she told pride to sit on the step and think about what it had done. Chen hung the panel memo in the team room with blue tape and no ceremony. Someone scribbled under it with a Sharpie, count the lives. No one erased it. Policy as graffiti. Maybe that's how it should be. Morrison started a habit of his own. Every week, he went to the range early, picked the worst lane, and shot the ugliest targets until his groupings told him he was still a student. He wrote down his misses. He told a kid about one at lunch. He listened more than he spoke. The policy that bore his name grew 2 pages longer and an ounce kinder. Rodriguez handled the thing he had been pretending not to, a letter to the families of the 8 from Cunha, telling them that a daughter had carried a piece of their fallen forward in a way that would have made funerals feel less final if anything could. He didn't send it yet. He held it the way you hold something fragile you mean to keep. On a Thursday that looked like a Tuesday, Maya took her team to Bay 7 and broke her own 4:17. The new time was 4:12. It printed on the plaque with a smell like hot pennies. Someone cheered. Someone swore softly, pleased. Maya wiped sweat from her temple and shook her head, as if to make sure the extra 5 seconds had been real. "This one doesn't go on the wall," she said. "We'll run out of paint. Keep the first. It reminds us what we learned that day." They did add something, though, under the time, a second line of small type that matched the first. "Precision has a conscience. M.W." At dusk, the porch filled again without invitation. They watched the Atlantic work on sunset like a patient craftsman. A gull rode an updraft and laughed at gravity. The ring hummed, a tune their bones knew. "I was thinking," Morrison said, which used to be a threat and was now a promise. "If the doctrine is bigger than us, and it is, we should make it portable. Put it somewhere even a dumb future commander can't kill it with neglect. Write it into the schoolhouse," Chen said. "And into procurement language. Tie it to money. Money remembers. Engrave it on something people want to touch," Rodriguez said, watching the watches. "A ritual that fits in a palm." Maya turned the watch face toward the dying light. She could see her father's hands in the engraving, imagined, not remembered, but no less true for that. "We'll put it where breath lives," she said. "On the line between inhale and exhale. Teach them to count to 3 before they decide who gets to keep breathing." They were quiet for the length of a small mercy. The station lights came up 1 notch. Someone somewhere dropped a tray. A child laughed in a corridor where children didn't used to be allowed. The rules had changed around the edges because someone printed a log on a dragon and a panel believed a kitchen story more than a vendor demo. "Your dad would be proud," Rodriguez said. "I'm not doing it for that," Maya said. "I know," he said. "That's why he would be." She picked up the watch and set it back on her wrist, 2 seconds fast. She didn't fix it. She had learned to live with drift. You correct for it. You breathe it in. You teach others how. Later, alone, she wrote another letter she wouldn't send. Not to her father this time, but to the child with bad weather eyes and the orange ball. "You will never know my name. Good. You will learn multiplication and forget fear slowly as it loses interest in you. Someday you'll hold your breath and count to 3 before you say something hard to someone you love. That will be the doctrine working. That will be enough." She slid the paper under the watch and turned out the light. The day clicked to its period. Tomorrow would bring a new problem, a new kid in the bay who needed permission to be careful, a new vendor with a glossy brochure, a new commander somewhere making a speech to hide a fear. The clocks would still be there, station and heart. She would match them before she shot. The plaque would still be cheap metal. The line would still be heavier than it had any right to be. Somewhere, a coloring sheet would live in a file as legal evidence that someone told the truth. Maya slept like a person who had done the math and decided to live with her answers. Chapter 8, The Last 2 Seconds. Alarms in space don't ring, they arrive in your teeth. Bay speakers stayed calm, but the deck felt tighter, as if the station itself had braced. Chen didn't waste voice. "Mercy arc has gone dark." The hollow rotated up from the table, a slow spinning cross between a ferry and a clinic. Mercy arc, a humanitarian ship on a loops of goodwill tour between orbital hospitals. She was parked near Earth, Moon L1, where gravity cancels and ships feel briefly forgiven for being heavy. Now her beacon babbled nonsense. A new overlay popped up, Paper Halo, the operation name you choose when you know the story matters as much as the steel. Morrison's jaw set. Crew. 46 medical staff, 31 patients, Chen said. Pediatrics, dialysis, 2 cardiac cases on bypass, 1 neonatal ward. Broadcasting a technical difficulties loop. We pulled the sideband, they're being held in their central spine. Hostiles have control of the docking collars and the engine room hatches. Flag? Rodriguez asked. No flag, Chen said. But their code smells familiar. A new window, a stream of diagnostic packets. Same vendor signature from Norfolk's hacked cameras. Their optical pipeline is loaded on ARC's internal security. If a human muzzle flash registers inside the spine, a cascade will trigger, auto shutters seal, sprinklers dump, halon substitute purges oxygen to suppress fire. In a hospital. They built a trap that kills scared people. Because a clean disaster sells their autonomous engagement, Maya said, steady. Humans look messy. Their box looks tidy. Time to catastrophic if we trip their narrative? Morrison asked. Minutes, Chen said. Maybe less if someone panics. He nodded once. Non-lethal first, surgical if we must. We go. The shuttle rose on a column of controlled violence and cut it mid-sentence. The transit out was longer than anyone wanted and shorter than fear needed to get fancy. L1 held them in an almost place, up and down reduced to suggestions. The arc hung in space like a lullaby someone had turned too loud. 2 clocks, Maya told herself over the hum. Ship and heart. Arc's life support cycled in 90-second breaths. Her own ran slower. She coaxed it down. Count 3. Again. Again. They docked on a maintenance collar the vendor hadn't bothered to booby-trap, arrogance doing what courage sometimes can't. The hatch spun. The air that hit their faces smelled like antiseptic and hot plastic. Gravity here was a polite rumor, enough to keep your stomach honest, not enough to forgive a stumble. Spine is a shotgun barrel, Rodriguez murmured, eye on the schematic. If we fire in there, the echoes aren't acoustic. They're systems. Then we don't, Maya said. They flowed down a service crawl alongside the spine. Through a grate, the central corridor revealed itself, patients strapped to gurneys, nurses keeping their voices in a frequency where children believe them, doctors with eyes that had learned statistics the hard way. 5 men in contractor black paced the length, exoplates matte, helmets down. One sat at a terminal with a familiar logo sticker slapped on the lid like a taunt, Halcyon. Drone nests? Morrison whispered. Locked onto ceiling rails, Chen said, feeding diagrams to their lenses. Optics hot, LiDAR hotter. They're slaved to a classifier looking for muzzle flashes, aggressive movement, and a small library of threat postures they scraped from training videos. Bad guys plan to hold the room, make us shoot, let the drone see the flash, then blame the purge on our recklessness. Cameras already prepped for press. Copy, Maya said. We make a different story. She pointed to a narrow shadow above the vending wall, a seam between a sprinkler main and a conduit. See the condensation forming? Halon substitute hasn't dumped yet. That main will push a liquid gas mix when it does. Chen, if I give you a 10-second window, can you precharge Sector C's water line instead of their purge? It'll throw flags, Chen said, fingers already breaking into Arc's angry little brain. Good. Rodriguez, Maya said. You still carry those antique glitter grenades? He patted a pouch. Chaff for people who don't believe in clouds. On my mark, Maya said. We make rain and snow and a bad camera day. Morrison, when visibility drops, you go low, tie up shooters with hands, not guns. No lethal unless we absolutely must. Nova, she glanced at the newest woman on the team, the one who moved like a sentence that already knew its period. You're my mirror on rail 2. If I say, pass, you pass like your name's on a plaque. Nova nodded, lip between teeth just once, then gone. The count started. Ship and heart. The arc exhaled, air cycling out of the spine into lungs and ducts. In the little vacuum that followed, Maya flicked her wrist. Rodriguez popped the chaff cans. Silver colonies exploded into the corridor, tiny squares drifting like a cheap constellation. At the same moment, Chen lied to a pipe and made it believe it was in a kitchen. Water blew into mist. The drone's lenses flowered with artifacts, mirrors multiplying mirrors. Now, Maya breathed. They dropped from the crawl into a corridor of snow. Patients coughed weakly, then calmed as nurses sang the way you sing to keep a room in one piece. A contractor pivoted, weapon rising. Morrison hit him mid-waist, the two bodies untangling and clanging and then going still under a nurse's glare. Quiet, she mouthed. He nodded like a man in church. Another guard swung his rifle toward the neonatal ward door, a rectangle of light and soft machines, and that was a shot a doctrine could live with. Maya took his wrist, low and lateral. The flechette shattered the joint and the gun fell. He didn't scream. He didn't get the air. Nova moved where Maya would have been if Maya had been 24 and fearless. She hit a third guard's knee, not center mass, and rode the recoil into the man's chest to pin him. Quiet, the same nurse mouthed. Two men with rifles obeyed a woman with a lanyard. Odd that it still surprises. At the far terminal, Halcyon Sticker lifted his head, saw nothing he could stage, and reached for a last option, a hardware toggle on the purge panel. He had it half-turned when Maya said, "Hold." The word wasn't for him. It was for herself and for the junior shooter on the catwalk above the NICU who had a clean line to the man's skull and the worst backstop in the galaxy, for incubators and a universe of future tenses. "Hold," Maya repeated, and the operator above her, the charismatic shooter who'd once lived on style, took his finger off his trigger, exhaled, and pressed his forehead to his scope like a mea culpa. "Chen," Maya said, voice steady. "I need that toggle to believe it's seen daylight." "I can spoof light," Chen said, already diving into the hardware dullness of an old junction box. "On 3. On 3, Maya echoed, but moved anyway. She slid along the bulkhead, feeling arc small tides, and lined the reticle on a seam in the panel's plastic faceplate, a weak spot meant for maintenance, not for miracles. She breathed down to the bottom of her lungs. Ship and heart. On 2, she pressed. The flechette slipped the seam, kissed the toggle's set screw, and spun it 1/4 turn in a direction that changed a purge into a diagnostic. The panel chirped its confusion, flashed test, and forced the system to wait out its own bureaucracy. "Done," Chen said, half laughing, half sick. "You bought us 90 seconds of paperwork." "That's all I ever asked from the universe," Rodriguez muttered, pinning a guard who had no idea how to fight in a corridor full of floating glitter and grumpy nurses. Halcyon Sticker went for a sidearm. Nova was there first, booting the weapon under a rolling cart of juice boxes. Morrison's arm became a bar around the man's shoulders. "End of shift," he said in a voice that meant it. 2 clocks. 90 seconds of paperwork is forever if you're careless and nothing if you're not. They worked like a room that had practiced being decent. Weapons down, zip ties up, drones euthanized with foam and curses. The babies kept breathing to metronomes. The dialysis pumps never hiccuped. A boy with an 4-pole asked Rodriguez if he was a pirate. "Only on Fridays," he whispered back, and the boy grinned as if he had been given a secret. By the time test aged into clear, the spine looked like a disaster drill someone competent had designed. The hostiles lay on their bellies with their hands where hands belong. The Halcyon terminal displayed a log that would survive a hearing, remote triggers, staged overlays, a script titled Human Error Demo. "Download everything," Chen said. "Print it on coloring sheets if you have to." "Already did," a nurse said, holding up a cartoon cat with timestamps and command IDs scrawled across its belly. They exfiltrated with fewer theatrics than they'd feared and more gratitude than they knew what to do with. On the shuttle home, no one spoke for a minute that felt like a ceremony. Then the charismatic shooter cleared his throat. "Permission to pass," he said softly, as if asking for absolution. "You already did," Maya said. "Twice." Back on the ring, the debrief was bones and muscle. No applause. Applause belongs to endings, and the work refuses to end. The log package went to Thompson with a subject line Chen enjoyed too much, paper halo, rained out. Legal got copies. Procurement got religion. 2 days later, the vendor's CEO sat where Morrison had once sat, hot lights, a panel, a jag, trying to explain why a product demo had included children. The hearing didn't need poetry. It had numbers. It had the coloring cat. After, Bay 9 took a breath. The plaque stayed the same, for 17, because Maya insisted it stay the same. "Not every miracle needs a new number," she said. But they did add a third line beneath the small quotes, paint barely bigger than a whisper, "Hold as a shot." G.W. Rodriguez finally mailed his letters. He used real stamps because some things earn glue. He stood at the box as if it were a grave and a gate. When the envelopes vanished, he felt lighter and older. He bought a jalapeno lemonade from the vending wall and found, to his disappointment, that he could still taste things. Morrison printed the restraint doctrine one last time and slid it into a binder that would outlive his command. He paged to the policy's end and wrote a coda in his compact hand: "Evaluate performance, not myth. Incentivize the pass. Punish the reckless, not the careful. Write names on the wins you don't take." He didn't sign it. He didn't have to. The men who would read it already knew the shape of his name. Chen framed the dragon coloring sheet and hung it in the intel cage where it could warn the next clever vendor that myth-making now had competition. She watched younger analysts stop to grin and then to think. "Let the absurdity work for us," she told them. "It's honest." Nova came off her first op high and wandered to the porch, the observation deck facing east. She found Maya there, rail under hands, the Atlantic pinned to the curve of the world like a photograph that kept developing. "How do you stop your hands from shaking after?" Nova asked. "I don't," Maya said. "I let them. Then I make them do something patient." She took off her watch, turned it face up on the rail. The engraving caught the last light. "MW, forever watching." It was still 2 seconds fast. "Why not fix it?" Nova asked, half shy, all earnest. "Because it reminds me not to chase being ahead," Maya said. "We count our drift and correct. Those 2 seconds are the gap I leave for mercy." They stood like that through a sunset that felt earned. The ring hummed beneath their feet, the reliable clock. Above, satellites winked like fishermen's lures. Below, a ship drew a white stitch across blue cloth and the seam held. "Your father," Nova started, then stopped. "Sorry. Not my business." "It is," Maya said. "We work in his house." She didn't look away from the horizon. "He taught me how to breathe around a rifle. He didn't get to teach me the rest." "You all did." Nova nodded. "You'll teach us the part after that." "We'll teach each other," Maya said. "Doctrine is a relay, not a sermon." They went back in when the cold found the edges of their ears. In Bay 9, 6 watches waited on a rubber mat. Maya guided the engraver's tip through initials with the care of a person rewriting a gene. She slipped one onto Nova's wrist. The younger woman looked at it as if it might tick loud enough to tell her what to do. "It won't," Maya said. "It'll just sit there and wait for you to choose." "What if I choose wrong?" "You'll write it down," Maya said. "So the next person won't." The ring lights dimmed by one. Somewhere, in a ward that didn't need to be a memorial, babies slept. On a porch that wasn't wood, a habit turned into a tradition without anyone giving it a speech. In a file cabinet labeled Policy, Active, a page at the back did the quiet work of saving strangers. Maya set her watch back on her wrist, felt the comfortable lie of its 2 seconds, and smiled. Tomorrow we shoot, she said to no one and to everyone. Tomorrow we pass. The bay answered with the soft click of bolts cycling, a chorus that sounded like a promise. If this story found you, come ride the next one with us. Subscribe to SciFi Nebula, where we aim for the heart, count the seconds, and tell the kinds of futures worth fighting for.